November 20, 1943, Batio Island, Tarawa Atoll, in the Gilbert Islands of the Central Pacific. Before dawn, waves of American landing craft carrying United States Marines of the 2nd Marine Division approach a heavily fortified beach barely 2 miles long. Naval planners have studied aerial photographs of the surrounding coral reef and concluded that the tide will be high enough for landing craft to pass over it without difficulty. They are wrong. A neap tide, an unusually shallow tide caused by the alignment of the sun and moon, leaves the reef exposed in water far too thin for the Higgins boats carrying the 2nd and 3rd waves of Marines. The boats run aground hundreds of yards from shore. Marines are forced out of their craft into chest-deep water, wading nearly 1,000 yards toward the beach, while Japanese machine guns and artillery, protected in coral and concrete emplacements, fire directly into the exposed men. Many drown under the weight of their own equipment before they ever reach dry sand. By the time Batio is declared secure, more than 1,000 Americans are dead and over 2,000 wounded in an assault on an island barely the size of New York's Central Park. The lesson of Tarawa is brutal and simple. No American commander can again send men onto a beach without knowing, in advance and with certainty, exactly what lies beneath the water. Out of that catastrophe, the United States Navy would build a force so unusual, so exposed, and so quietly terrifying in its method that Japanese defenders, men behind concrete pillboxes, coastal guns, and minefields, would come to recognize a specific, dreaded sight in the days before an invasion. A handful of nearly naked men, swimming calmly through the surf zone in broad daylight, mapping their defenses while explosions and gunfire erupted around them. They were the Underwater Demolition Teams. History would remember them as the frogmen, and their presence off a beach became one of the most reliable warnings in the Pacific War that a Japanese-held island's final hours had begun. By late 1943, the United States and its allies had adopted a strategy in the Pacific known as island hopping, seizing a chain of Japanese-held islands, one after another, to build a path of airfields and forward bases toward the Japanese home islands. Each of these islands required an amphibious assault, thousands of men put ashore directly into the teeth of prepared enemy defenses from ships offshore. The technical problem was straightforward to describe and murderously difficult to solve. Pacific islands were frequently ringed by coral reefs, invisible or nearly invisible from the surface, that could tear open the hull of a landing craft or simply strand it far from shore. Japanese engineers, anticipating amphibious landings, had also begun placing physical obstacles in the surf zone, wooden stakes, concrete tetrahedrons, and mines, specifically designed to wreck landing craft before they reached the beach. Existing intelligence methods could not solve this problem. Aerial photography, the primary tool available to planners in 1943, could not reliably distinguish between water that was 5 feet deep and water that was 2 feet deep, nor could it detect obstacles submerged beneath the surface. Submarine periscope reconnaissance offered a narrow, distant view unsuited to detailed beach mapping. The result, as Tarawa proved, was that American commanders were sending men ashore based on guesswork dressed up as certainty. What the Navy needed was direct, close-range, human reconnaissance of the exact underwater terrain the invasion force would cross, and a means of physically clearing whatever obstacles were found before the first wave of troops arrived. That requirement would define an entirely new category of naval combat unit. This was not a problem unique to the Pacific. Planners preparing for the eventual invasion of German-occupied Europe faced the same fundamental gap between what aerial photography could show and what a landing force actually needed to know before crossing a defended beach. At the same time American commanders were absorbing the lessons of Tarawa, plans were being finalized for the invasion of Normandy, where the coastline was known to be heavily fortified with underwater mines and obstacles specifically designed to gut a landing craft, and a new strategy for dealing with both problems was needed on both sides of the world at once. This shared urgency explains why two roughly parallel organizations, Kaufman's Atlantic-facing naval combat demolition units and Turner's Pacific-facing underwater demolition teams, took shape within months of one another, addressing the same underlying failure of intelligence with the same underlying solution. Put trained men directly into the water, close enough to touch the obstacles themselves, before committing a single soldier or Marine to the beach. The man most closely associated with building this force was Draper Lawrence Kaufman, born in 1911, a 1933 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. Poor eyesight had denied him a commission in the peacetime Navy, a policy made stricter by Depression-era budget cuts that limited how many Annapolis graduates could receive active commissions at all. Kaufmann instead took a civilian job with a shipping line, working in Hamburg, Germany, during the years of Adolf Hitler's rise to power. He developed a lasting hostility toward the Nazi regime, feelings that intensified after Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. Kaufmann volunteered as an ambulance driver in France in 1940, was captured by German forces, and was later released. He made his way to England, where he obtained a commission in the Royal Navy Reserve and trained as a bomb disposal officer, a role that placed him in direct, repeated contact with unexploded ordnance under wartime conditions. This experience made him a natural candidate when the U.S. Navy needed someone to organize a bomb and mine disposal school in Washington, D.C. The officer who set the entire chain of events in motion was Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of amphibious forces in the Central Pacific. It was Turner who, in the aftermath of the Tarawa disaster, ordered the formation of dedicated units to conduct hydrographic reconnaissance and obstacle removal ahead of amphibious landings. Turner directed roughly 180 men to the Waimanalo Amphibious Training Base on Oahu, Hawaii, for specialized training, men who would become the nucleus of the Pacific Underwater Demolition Teams. Kaufmann's path toward the Pacific ran directly through the bomb and mine disposal school he organized in Washington. It was there, while Kaufmann was in charge of the mine disposal school, that Admiral Turner first approached him about developing underwater demolition teams, a conversation that grew directly out of the broader amphibious planning problems the Navy had confronted since its earliest major landing operation of the war. The November 1942 assault on North Africa, when roughly 400,000 men went ashore from close to 900 ships against comparatively light resistance, but still convinced planners that far more capable beach-clearing operations would eventually be required. Kaufmann's earliest work in the Pacific theater was itself hands-on and dangerous in the extreme. His first major assignment after arriving in the Pacific was to disarm a 500-pound bomb that had struck Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, work that drew directly on the bomb disposal training he had received in wartime England. Separately and slightly earlier, Kaufmann had already been building a parallel capability on the Atlantic side of the war. On June 6, 1943, the Naval Combat Demolition Unit Training School was established at Fort Pierce, Florida, organized by Lieutenant Commander Draper Kaufmann, who drew his first volunteers from the bomb and mine disposal school he had organized in Washington and from the Civil Engineering Corps and CB Training School at Camp Peary, Virginia. These two efforts, Turner's Pacific Reconnaissance Teams and Kaufmann's Atlantic-trained demolition units, would eventually merge into a single Pacific-wide organization, the Underwater Demolition Teams. Tarawa itself stands as the war's most costly failed attempt to solve the reef problem through conventional planning. Although Navy and Marine Corps planners had identified coral as a potential issue before the landing, they incorrectly assumed landing craft would be able to cross over it regardless of tide conditions. That single miscalculation, multiplied across thousands of men in open boats under fire, produced one of the costliest 76 hours in Marine Corps history to that point. The Navy's early attempts to correct the problem were also imperfect. After Tarawa, Admiral Turner feared a repeat disaster at the next target, Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. A nighttime reconnaissance risked running the team aground on unseen coral or into Japanese ambushes, so the first underwater demolition team instead conducted 2 daylight reconnaissance missions, approaching the target in a rubber boat, but the coral itself prevented the team from getting close enough to shore to properly assess conditions. This failure carried an important lesson. Reconnaissance from a boat, however cautiously conducted, could not get close enough to a defended reef to produce useful intelligence. During the Kwajalein operation, 2 Seabees stripped down to swim trunks and swam across the enemy reef themselves to gather the needed information, an improvised solution born of necessity rather than doctrine. It worked, and it pointed directly toward the method that would define the underwater demolition teams for the rest of the war. Not boats, not periscopes, not aerial photography, but men in the water, swimming the reef by hand. Early teams also experimented with heavier gear and combat equipment, on the assumption that reconnaissance swimmers would need to defend themselves. UDT-1 initially wore fatigues and full combat gear rather than swim trunks during its earliest missions, a choice that slowed the swimmers, made them more visible, and offered little real protection against the machine gun and mortar fire directed at the surf zone. This too would be abandoned once commanders concluded that speed, low visibility in the water, and the ability to dive and surface quickly mattered more than carrying arms the men could not effectively use while swimming. The breakthrough that defined the underwater demolition teams was not a single invention, but the combination of three deliberate choices, refined through 1943 and 1944, stripped-down swimming reconnaissance, precisely engineered demolition charges, and daylight operations conducted under direct naval gunfire support. Following the lessons of Kwajalein, UDT swimmers were equipped only with swim trunks, a diving mask, and fins, the outfitting that earned them the nickname Naked Warriors. Carrying no weapons and almost no equipment beyond a slate for recording notes, a lead line for measuring water depth, and a knife for cutting and tangling lines, a swimmer presented the smallest possible target and the greatest possible speed and endurance in the water. Teams worked in pairs, swim buddies, moving along the reef in a coordinated line, taking depth soundings at regular intervals, and marking the location of obstacles, mines, and underwater terrain features on waterproof slates strapped to their forearms or thighs. Frogmen received intensive training beyond basic demolition work: how to swim without making a visible splash, how to keep their arms and legs beneath the surface, how to angle their masks to prevent sunlight from reflecting off the glass and revealing their position, and how to camouflage exposed skin. Off Okinawa in 1945, swimmers used aluminum paint as camouflage against the water's surface glare, a detail that captures how far the tactics had evolved from the improvised swim at Kwajalein little more than a year earlier. The demolition half of the mission required equally precise engineering. Once a swim survey identified obstacles, coral heads too shallow for landing craft, wooden stakes driven into the reef, concrete or steel tetrahedrons or moored mines, demolition swimmers returned to place explosive charges, commonly blocks of tetratol wired together along a common detonating cord, allowing dozens or even hundreds of individual obstacles to be destroyed in a single, coordinated blast. This required the demolitioneers, many of them trained originally as Seabees and combat engineers, to calculate charge sizes precisely enough to clear an obstacle without producing debris that would itself endanger landing craft. The men who carried out this work did not, during the war itself, even use the name history would later remember them by. During World War II, the Navy had no formal rating and no official insignia for the underwater demolition teams. The men who wore the Construction Battalion, or CB, designation on their uniforms considered themselves Seabees performing underwater demolition work, and did not commonly refer to themselves as UDTs or frogmen, but rather as demolitioneers, a term carried over from the original naval combat demolition units and from Kaufman's practice of recruiting directly from the CB dynamiting and demolition school. The now famous nicknames were in large part applied to them afterward by history and by the press, rather than adopted by the men themselves as a badge of identity while the war was still being fought. Crucially, none of this happened in secrecy from the enemy. Unlike commando raids conducted under cover of darkness, UDT reconnaissance and demolition missions were frequently carried out in broad daylight, screened by naval gunfire and covered by small gunboats that traded fire directly with Japanese shore batteries while the swimmers worked the reef in full view of the defenders. This was, in effect, reconnaissance and combat engineering performed as an act of controlled violence, the Navy accepting exposure and casualties among the covering ships and the swimmers themselves in exchange for beach intelligence precise enough to prevent a repeat of Tarawa. The teams organized at Waimanalo completed their first round of training by December 1943 and were immediately shipped to the Marshall Islands for their first combat mission at Kwajalein Atoll in January 1944. The results were decisive enough that underwater demolition teams were quickly folded into the standard planning process for every subsequent Central Pacific amphibious operation. Between December 1944 and August 1945 alone, UDT personnel saw action in every major Pacific amphibious landing, including Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Angkor, Ulithi, Peleliu, Leyte, Lingayen Gulf, Zambales, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Labuan, Brunei Bay, and Borneo, a record that, combined with earlier 1944 operations, made the UDTs one of the most consistently deployed specialized units of the entire Pacific War. Draper Kaufman's own combat record illustrates how completely the concept had been validated by mid-1944. In April 1944, he was ordered to the Pacific Fleet, first as commanding officer of Underwater Demolition Team 5, then as senior staff officer for underwater demolition teams across the amphibious forces, Pacific Fleet. As commander of UDT-5, Kaufman participated in the invasion of Saipan, receiving the Navy Cross for leading a daylight reconnaissance of hostile beaches under heavy fire, and on July 10, 1944, for leading a night reconnaissance of hostile beaches on the island of Tinian. It was during that Tinian mission that Kaufman himself experienced firsthand exactly how close the margin between success and disaster could be for a man conducting reconnaissance on an enemy-held beach. Crawling across a moonlit stretch of Tinian's shore, Kaufman heard voices nearby and, realizing they belonged to a Japanese patrol rather than one of his own men, was forced to slip out of his swim trunks, roll in the sand to camouflage his body, and remain motionless, gripping his knife as the enemy patrol passed within feet of his position. The incident underscores what every UDT mission demanded: operating for extended periods on or near enemy-controlled ground with no weapon capable of holding off a determined patrol, relying entirely on stealth, discipline, and the covering fire of ships offshore. As the war moved toward the Japanese home islands through 1944 and 1945, the scale of UDT operations grew dramatically, and so did the price the Japanese defenders extracted from the men conducting them. The reconnaissance of Iwo Jima's beaches in February 1945 illustrates both the scale of these operations and the risk involved. On February 17, 1945, 4 underwater demolition teams, UDT-12, UDT-13, UDT-14, and UDT-15, were carried to their objective aboard the fast destroyer transports Bull, Bates, Barr, and Blessman, launching landing craft that took the swimmers close to the beach, while 7 destroyers and 7 LCI gunboats provided covering fire. The Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, watching this armada of small craft approach in daylight, made a critical assumption that this was the invasion itself. As the LCI gunboats carrying the reconnaissance teams moved toward the beach, Japanese fire began to concentrate on them, and all 12 gunboats involved were hit, suffering heavy damage and casualties. One gunboat, LCI G-449, was hit repeatedly by artillery, mortar, and heavy machine gun fire, and suffered more than 60% casualties among its crew, yet none of the gunboats would abandon the swimmers still working in the water. That premature Japanese response, though costly to the American gunboat crews, produced an unintended intelligence windfall. It forced Japanese gun positions